Welcome to another edition of AML Conversations. Today, we're happy to welcome back Les Joseph. Les was kind enough to sit down with us in the middle of 2024 after he retired after 14 years at Wells Fargo and many, many more years at the Department of Justice, where we talked both about his career work in dealing with financial crime issues, but also some of the thoughts he had going forward. Today, what we want to do is Les wrote back in November, and this can be found on the website BioCatch. This is a blog piece that he wrote that struck me as both not just relevant, but an area where we all talk around the issue of fraud, but we haven't come up yet with enough ideas. I don't think we come up with some, but enough ideas to figure out what's the best strategy, solution, recommendations to deal with this. And Les wrote a piece entitled, "We Need a General in the War Against Fraud." So we're going to talk a bit about that today. And as I said, Les joins us for a second time. So Les, thank you so much. Happy New Year. Really appreciate you taking some time today.
Thanks, John. Happy New Year to you. And it's great to be with you. And thanks for putting this topic on the agenda.
Let's start with this. The premise that we all understand is the explosion of fraud in the past, 5 years, past decade, obviously from all sorts of things that we've covered, from elder abuse to payment fraud to issues from the COVID scams and everything else, that it continues to challenge financial institutions of all sizes. And of course, the government. Give us your sense of being somebody who was both in it, in the private sector, but work with a lot of public sector partners. You know, some of the issues that maybe we don't think about when we talk about the explosion of fraud.
Sure, John. Yeah, as you say, everybody's familiar with the problem of elder fraud. You know, many people know somebody in their family or friends who's been the victim of these kinds of fraud, which are often perpetrated via social media. And the amount of money involved is just crazy. And the scary thing is that these fraudsters are very well organized. They're very sophisticated. They know how banks work. They groom people for months, and it's a very pernicious problem. So the criminals are well organized. The problem is that our response, the response of the United States to this problem and to protecting our citizens from this problem, is very disjointed. And there's a lot of amazing people doing a lot of amazing things to fight fraud. You know, if you're on LinkedIn, you see, many of these people with ideas and discussing some of the great work that they've been doing, but yet we don't seem to be making too much progress against the fraudsters. And in my view, it's because our response is disjointed. There's no coordination of efforts or resources, despite all the good work and all the energy behind this. And I think, as I said in my blog, it's because there's no leader, no one really leading this effort who has any kind of authority. So again, our law enforcement folks, they're making tremendous cases. It's gratifying, but they're working on a case-by-case basis. And this was one of my, when I was a prosecutor, in responding to problems, I would always see is that they're looking at cases. They're not trying to, and I'm not disparaging them, but they're not addressing problems holistically, because that's how they work. They work on cases, and you have different law enforcement agencies working on different cases. So there's no overall threat analysis or coordinated approach towards the problem.
One of the things that had caught your eye and I think made you decide you wanted to write this blog was the announcement back in November from FinCEN that it had joined a multi-sector national task force on fraud and scam prevention. That was something put together by the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program. I'm not as familiar with that and maybe some others aren't either. Talk a bit about that. And, when FinCEN made that announcement, And as you said, we've addressed, meaning the proverbial the financial crime prevention community. We've addressed fraud over the years. There's certainly a bank fraud working group within the federal government. And obviously you see a lot of guidance come out from IRS or HSI, FBI, and others. But to your point, the coordination appears to be lacking. So talk a bit about, what drove this in front of you back in November.
Exactly as you say, John. It was when I saw that announcement by FinCEN that they had joined this effort by the Aspen Institute, and credit to the Aspen Institute for trying to put together a coalition of folks to address fraud. But when I saw that FinCEN, a federal agency, joined a private sector initiative to address fraud, it just really shocked me, because it's the federal government that should be leading this effort. And if any agency is really in a position to lead, it would be FinCEN, because they have the benefit of all of the SARs filed by all of the financial institutions, many of which relate to this problem of fraud and elder fraud. And so when I read that announcement, it just really said, wait a second, this isn't the way to approach the problem, because I've been involved in several private sector initiatives or nonprofit initiatives to address this problem, and they're all very well intentioned, and they all again have good people and good ideas, but they don't have any authority to drive an effort. And here you have FinCEN that could bring all the banks together. I know they do. They have, when I was at the bank, they had these FinCEN exchanges where they would bring banks and law enforcement together to discuss these issues. And even though, again, they didn't really drive an agenda, at least they were sharing information. So it was really that article that made me think that we're approaching the problem the wrong way.
Not to defend FinCEN, but perhaps it was a staffing issue. Who knows? But I think your point is more than well taken, because you and I have been involved over decades with private-public partnering, but those partners were really driven mainly by the government seeking input from experts outside the government, not the other way around. And you took a look at that, and you said that similar to what we did in the States back in the late 80s, the creation of what was then called the Office of National Drug Control Policy created at that time a drug czar. And some of you and I are old enough to remember that was Bill Bennett was the first drug czar. Later on, it was actually General McCaffrey was a drug czar, because I know he spoke at some of our anti-money laundering conferences. And that was created by legislation back in the 80s. And so you looked at that as a potential parallel, and there were some parallels, but also, as you looked at it, some areas where maybe that wouldn't be the answer. Talk a bit about that and the overall theme of creating a central place, whether it's a federal czar or a section of the government, something to organize and to coordinate.
Sure. You could designate, the president, if he were so inclined, could easily designate a fraud czar as somebody who would be the point of contact for fraud. But if all it were to be the designation of a fraud czar without any authority, without any budget, then that would be symbolic. That person would have no authority. The other option with a fraud czar is, as you say, the way that the drug czar was created, which was actually the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which was created by Congress and was a separate office with staffing and budget and authority. And whether or not that worked very well, it at least was a good idea. But the problem with that is, of course, that required congressional action. And if that were to even come about, that would be about 2 years in the making. And of course, the objective of the new administration is to cut budgets, not to add budgets, and not to increase the size of the federal government. So I kind of saw the drug czar idea as a non-starter. It was not going to work in this case.
Yeah, and I think the drug czar, as I remember, was more of this isn't a pejorative, but it was more of a bully pulpit, because it didn't have the authority. It certainly could do press conferences and releases, but I think for the most part, like you say, without enough resources and authority. And that's an age-old issue in the U.S. government, probably many other governments. We know from the 9/11 Commission review of 9/11 that there was obviously a gap in coordination and collaboration between the intelligence agencies and the FBI. And it's pretty similar here, not because each of these agencies can't benefit from working with other law enforcement and other agencies to deal with fraud. Because as you say in your blog, there was a financial fraud enforcement task force back in 2009. There was a whole host of other things, but none of these things have really moved the needle, as they say, right? I mean, so taking the czar concept, taking the centralization concept, all the research and the work you've done, and you've been part of a lot of this, sort of how did you conclude? And it maybe to lead, not to lead your answer, but I know you mentioned the United Kingdom, so maybe you want to talk a bit about what they did, and then what did you conclude looking at all of this?
Well, the United Kingdom did create, a sort of drug czar position, or they call it an anti-fraud champion, whose purpose was to drive the government's effort to tackle fraud against individuals and businesses and support delivery of the fraud strategy, including working with industry, private industry, to secure collaboration, engage with international counterparts to tackle fraud, and coordinate cross-government efforts to cut fraud. And it's a great idea, but again, I don't know enough about it, but I don't think that person really has the authority, the budget authority, the authority to drive change that would be necessary to accomplish something about this. So it's a good start. It's trying. It's recognizing the fact that they need a leader. They need somebody to recognize, to address the fraud problem. I'm just not sure that they've thought it all the way through or developed it all the way through.
In the UK, how long did it take from inception to implementation? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I think it took a couple of years. The UK has actually been moving pretty fast in this area, faster than any other country, and they've taken a lot of measures, including a recent measure to require financial institutions or payment service providers to reimburse victims of scams, which is going to be the topic of my next blog for BioCatch, which is an interesting idea. So they're really trying to move forward in this area, putting pressure on banks and other companies to address this. So I give them credit for doing that.
So as you look through all of this, where did you end up in terms of, at least for now, how to proceed going forward? Where did you end up with all the research that you did on this?
Again, it's being old has a few advantages, not too many, but one of which is some history. And so I thought back to efforts by the Department of Justice to address a problem. And I thought back to the savings and loan crisis at the end of the 1980s, where due to the liberalization of rules for savings and loans, because they were, this goes back to an interest rate issue, which we're dealing with now, but because of the interest rates and this way savings and loan were set up, they were going bankrupt. And so Congress gave them power to engage in other types of businesses, real estate development that they, hadn't been involved with. Mostly they were doing residential mortgages. So this opened up the industry to new opportunities, and a variety of scamsters and fraudsters quickly took advantage of this situation to start doing real estate development and real bubble in the real estate market down in Dallas, building condominiums that they weren't needed and flipping them back and forth among various people. And it led to a number of banks going under, which the federal government, of course, was required to bail out. So the response to that problem was that the Attorney General created a Dallas bank fraud task force on his own. He was able to do that on his own. I'm sure he had input from people, but he was able to do that without a new budget, although they got some supplemental resources, without creating a new bureaucracy, but just by designating resources and putting pressure on U.S. attorneys. And I thought, the Attorney General is the one person who can drive change without any, pronouncement from the president or resources from Congress, because all federal prosecutions have to go through the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, or the main justice. And so, if law enforcement folks want to get their cases prosecuted, they have to more or less, follow along with the lead of the Attorney General. And if the Attorney General says we want to prosecute cases related to this savings and loan project, you can bet the law enforcement agencies will focus their resources on those cases. So so following the lead of the Dallas Bank Fraud Task Force, they put a lot of pressure. They created a task force coordinator in every U.S. Attorney's office. They had a task force in Dallas and some other cities, and driven, in part by Main Justice and the resources of the fraud section there. And they were able to bring about amazing results. So I thought back to that model and say, if the Attorney General says fraud and elder fraud is going to be a priority for the Department of Justice, and he tells the U.S. attorneys that this is going to be one of our priorities going forward, then people have to listen to that, because he has the authority and the power to drive that change. He or she.
Right. I know you also, and we won't have time to deep dive into this, but I also want to highlight the fact that earlier this year in 2025, you wrote not an update to this, but it's still dealing with fraud prevention. You wrote a piece on the same website, BioCatch, on their blog channel on social media, and you said, "Welcome to the fight against fraud and child exploitation." So obviously a lot to unpack there, but I want to just give us the highlights of that. So you point out that financial institutions can certainly do more. Obviously, you've just talked about how the government can do more in this space, but given where we are, sadly, with social media, given where we are, it's a new administration, so we have no idea how they're going to address white collar crime. Part of that is who they put in role. Part of that is what's the overall mission of the agencies going forward. But there'll always be law enforcement agencies that have this in their portfolio. They'll have to deal with fraud and all of that. But the social media angle, what is it? And I know you could talk at length about this, but what is it briefly that we don't appreciate as financial crime fighters, if you will, that social media can do to help in the battle against fraud by perhaps partnering with law enforcement?
If you look at these scams, John, as you well know, while the bank is the end point, right? The bank is the point where people are separated from their money, and that's the last point in the process. But if you look at where these scams start, it's almost always on social media. It's either or through the communications industry. So they start out on Facebook frequently, or other social media networks, or they start out through texts that people receive, or sometimes emails where people figure out a way to introduce themselves and insinuate themselves into the lives of victims. And that's how these scams get started. And then they develop these relationships, and then they often move over to WhatsApp or Telegram, where they're more difficult to follow. But so the bank is the end point, and people always look to the banks to solve this problem. And banks certainly have their role, and they can do more and are doing more. I want to give banks credit for doing that, but they can't solve the problem alone, and people shouldn't look to them to solve the problem. So we need to get these social media companies involved in this. And of course, social media companies aren't regulated. Banks are highly regulated. That's why pressure can be put on them. Nobody's putting pressure on these social media companies. And as you indicate, probably less pressure during this next administration. But they are an integral part of the problem. And so they need to be brought into this effort to help clamp down on these scams. And again, in the UK has recognized this, and they're bringing them into the fight. And this is critical in the US to address these scams as well, because that's where they're starting.
Les Joseph, his blogs can be found on biocatch.com. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity.